At 9:10 on the morning of Wednesday 26 January 1949, Tillicoultry in Clackmannanshire was rocked by an explosion that reverberated throughout the town. A powder magazine at the quarry had exploded. Buildings rocked, roofs were ripped off, ceilings fell down, and hundreds of windows were shattered by the blast. Alexander Honeyman, a quarry worker, was killed. Tillicoultry Quarry, situated on the west side of the burn, had offices, huts, equipment stores and machinery on site, and situated a safe distance away was the powder magazine. It was constructed of brick and lined with wood, and situated on an embankment on the hillside, away from the main working quarry face. At around 9 o'clock, 44-year-old Honeyman, an experienced shot firer, shouted a cheery "good morning" to a member of the office staff as they made their way to the offices to start their working day. It was believed he'd been busy fitting caps to fuses when the powder magazine suddenly exploded. The noise was terrific and reverberated around the quarry and beyond. Buildings at the quarry collapsed, and dirt and debris were thrown high into the air, only to rain down on the houses of the town, especially those closest to the quarry. As far away as Alva, Dollar, Alloa, and even Dunfermline and Fife, the blast was heard, and people knew instantly something was wrong. Quarry blasting was a common occurrence, and the townsfolk knew the noise of these usual blasts. But this was different. Every building at the quarry was damaged. In a Nissen hut just 30 yards away from the magazine, the managing director of Tillicoultry Quarries Limited, Robert Wallace Menzies, had a narrow escape. He was lifted off his feet in the blast and catapulted halfway out a window. The Nissen hut was completely destroyed, but he only sustained a slight injury. It was only thanks to the magazine being on the embankment that there was not a greater loss of life. 15 men were working at the quarry at the time, but the impact on the embankment saved them from injury. A roll call took place within minutes of the blast to make sure everyone was safe, but when Honeyman's name was called, there was no answer. Wreckage from the blast was scattered over a wide area. Wooden huts were now piles of wood. The compressor house was completely destroyed, and where the magazine had stood was a huge crater. George Honeyman, Alexander's brother, also worked at the quarry. His 9-year-old son Billy had just dropped off his piece and was leaving when the explosion happened. The boy was between the powder magazine and offices and was thrown 30 feet into the air. He suffered an injury to his head, and his legs were likely scorched by the heat of the explosives. As mentioned, Tillicoultry suffered damage as far as the High Street, where early morning shoppers were thrown off their feet. People who witnessed the explosion from the town said there was a blinding flash of light, followed immediately by a loud roar. The quarry disappeared behind a massive cloud of dust. It was likened to a volcano erupting. The worst damage was in the upper part of the town, nearest the quarry. The house closest to it, Castle Craig, was occupied by Mrs. Muirhead. She was just finishing making her bed when the blast occurred, toppling over a wardrobe which pinned her to the bed. It saved her life, as debris and rock crashed through her home. The ceiling collapsed, but she was rescued by neighbours, although she suffered severely from shock. At a house called the Shieling, the home of Mr. and Mrs. R.G. Hunter, every ceiling collapsed, and all the windows shattered. Mrs. Dundas, who also lived close to the quarry, stated, "First the fire blew out, then the windows were blown in, and the doors were thrown open." At Rose Cottage, occupied by the Frame family, Most of the north side of their roof was destroyed, and Mrs. Frame described it as though the blast had lifted her house. William Hunter of Dixon Place suffered severe cuts caused by flying glass. There was barely a house in the old part of the town that was not damaged. Shattered roof tiles, pieces from chimneys, glass and other debris covered the roads. In Upper Mill Street, although the damage wasn't quite so bad, roof tiles were lost, windows shattered, and a number of ceilings collapsed. At Westerton Farm, the roof of the byre was ripped off, while in Jimison Gardens and Walker Terrace, the houses suffered roof and window damage. Interior plasterwork was cracked. At Middleton Mill, in Upper Mill Street, windows were smashed, and workers rushed home to see if their houses were still intact. The shoppers in the High Street had narrow escapes, as plate glass windows came crashing to the ground. Among the shops damaged were the Co-op drapery and the butchers, Betton Hardy, the paper shop and printers, and the Union Street bakery and grocery. The Crown Hotel and the public library were also damaged. At Lower Mill Street, at John D. Peyton's factory, 120 windows and roof lights were smashed. Luckily, no one was injured, although several suffered from shock. Like the mill workers in Upper Mill Street, many left Peyton's to see how their houses had fared. Damage was also sustained as far away as Hamilton Street. Another side effect of the explosion was the loss of electricity. The supply had been badly damaged on the northern side of the town and caused many businesses to close for a short time. Soon repairs got underway, with local tradesmen getting their workforce to leave whatever job they were doing to help the people of the town. Slaters, plasterers, joiners and glaziers began making temporary repairs to make the damaged homes habitable. Neighbours rallied round and did what they could for those affected. Hundreds of people went to the scene of the disaster and were amazed at the amount of damage done to property, but equally amazed that no one else was killed. The Secretary of State for Scotland, Arthur Woodburn MP, visited the town, and along with Provost William Jimison and members of the town council, saw first-hand the damage. He said that his sympathies were with all those who had suffered, and that the Department for Health in Scotland would do all it could to help. Provost Jimison also expressed his deep sense of gratitude to everyone who so kindly and willingly offered their help. An inquiry was held into the disaster on Wednesday 23rd February at Alloa Sheriff Court before Sheriff D. L. Murray. Giving evidence, Ian Duncan of Sauchie said he reported for his duties at the office at 9 a.m. On his way up to the foreman's hut, he had to pass the powder magazine, where he saw Honeyman working at the door of it, fixing detonators to fuses to make plugs. He had just reached the hut, which lay about 7 yards away, when the explosion took place. The side of the hut was blown out. Materials, rocks and earth went skywards. After he'd recovered, he made his way to the magazine, but nothing remained of it, just a big hole in the ground, and there was no sign of Honeyman. Workmen then began digging around the crater to try and find him, but all they found were pieces of his overalls. James McFarlane, Honeyman's assistant, said that on that fateful morning he was drilling holes in the whinstone at the quarry so the charges of explosives could be inserted. Honeyman had told him he was going to make up some detonators before the rain came, so left and headed towards the magazine. Shortly afterwards there was a flash and a boom. McFarlane was lifted off his feet and landed on his back. Loose rubble fell on him, but he managed to scramble away. He then ran towards the magazine, and only saw the deep crater where it had once stood. He was asked if Honeyman was a careful worker. He replied, "Very," and that he was well used to handling explosives. He said that no one was allowed to go near there, and the only other person to have a set of keys was the manager. Robert Anderson, the foreman, also gave evidence. Shortly before 9, he'd been discussing the day's work with him when Menzies had approached them. Honeyman then carried on, walking towards the magazine. Anderson headed to the office and had just stepped inside when the explosion took place. He too was asked about Honeyman's safety record and told the court it was exemplary. The manager, Menzies, then gave his testimony. He had just gone to his office and was opening some letters when the blast occurred. "The office collapsed about me," he said. Dust and fine earth was swirling around when he emerged from the office. He made his way immediately to the magazine, where he saw the workmen who had already arrived and were trying to find Honeyman. He confirmed the magazine conformed to the industry specifications, and although he didn't know how much explosive was in there had been a delivery earlier that month. This was polar aminol gelignite, an explosive called number 704. He told the inquiry Honeyman didn't smoke and was an extremely careful workman. He said the cause of the explosion was a complete mystery. One of the last to testify was George Honeyman. He was an excavator driver at the quarry and had last seen his brother around 8:20 that morning. He'd started at 6, and it was customary for his son to bring him his breakfast. As soon as young Billy had dropped it off and was heading away, the explosion occurred, and his first thought was for his son's safety. He met him running towards him. Then he headed to the magazine, knowing his brother was there. But there was nothing to see. An explosives engineer from ICI in Glasgow, Thomas William Edmund, had visited the scene shortly after the explosion. He had made a thorough investigation, but could only surmise what may have happened. He thought it possible Honeyman had laid some detonators on the floor in order to reach the explosives, and some kind of heavy object, such as a container or case, had fallen onto them, setting them off. Alexander Honeyman had worked at the quarry for 29 years and left behind a widow and twin sons, Eric and Alistair.